Well, we thought we'd seen it all yesterday, but then this is, of course, Lewis Hamilton. He's now P10 on the grid, as I said yesterday, right in the middle of the pack going into turn one for the Brazilian Grand Prix proper. And he survived. Not only did he survive, but he was aggressive from the start, off the line, looking for slots, looking for gaps. And by lap 6, Lewis Hamilton was P3 in the Brazilian Grand Prix. Very bad news, of course, for Red Bull Honda at that point. Valtteri Bottas had made it pretty easy for him to get past, I have to say. But this was Lewis Hamilton on an unbelievable charge in the Mercedes. Talk about adrenaline. The next target, the main target in the early phase of the race, of course, was Sergio Pérez. And it wasn't going to be easy to pass Sergio in the Red Bull Honda. As I've said many times on these videos, Sergio very, very good in defence. There was a lovely moment about lap 16 when Sergio got on the radio and says, "Tell Max to give me a DRS." Of course, he's referring to the top speed that Lewis and the Mercedes had, something we've been talking about all weekend since Friday. And that, of course, proved to be a major advantage for Lewis and for Valtteri Bottas during the race. But the big question then was whether or not Max Verstappen, who was about 3 seconds in front of Sergio at this point, was going to actually slow down towards the end of one of his laps to give a tow to Sergio, to try to get him away from Lewis Hamilton. Did he do that? No, of course he didn't. I mean, he is a very good number 2 to Max, but it doesn't mean to say that Max has to play the sort of number 1.5 to Sergio. So it was Sergio on his own defending from Lewis, and Lewis looking really ominous in the mirrors of that number 2 Red Bull Honda. So how did Lewis eventually get past him? Well, he pulled off what was to become his trademark pass for the weekend, obviously getting an incredible run out of that last corner. As we talked about yesterday, he's so good out of that last corner, getting a run on the straight, and then of course with DRS helping him to get in the tow. It was then a question of how actually to do the pass, because when you're talking about a driver like Sergio Pérez, he is going to use all the road, he is going to brake very late going into turn 1. So Lewis did this time and again. He would go down the inside to try to make Sergio go down the inside, to protect the inside, to get offline slightly. And then having made Sergio move, Lewis would then do the opposite, move right to the outside, get a beautiful run through turns 1 and 2, down that straight, which is a DRS straight as well, that back straight, down into turn 4. Except on this occasion, he kind of relaxed a little bit, braked a little bit early. Sergio, of course, was in Lewis's tow and DRS at this point, and repassed Lewis. Now, to Lewis's credit, he didn't actually do much. He just sort of sat there and thought, that was a bit crazy, what was I doing? And pulled off the manoeuvre correctly the following lap. In other words, he got the pass going down the straight, but then really made sure that he got turn 4 as quick as possible, pulled away and got away from Sergio Pérez. But that was that was an interesting moment for Sergio, because I've been saying all along how good is he in defence, but you got to say that wasn't bad in attack either. Anyway, that was Sergio Pérez, who late in the race was brought in for a new set of tyres and set fastest lap just to mitigate some of the loss that Red Bull incurred today in terms of points against Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton. Well, I won't tell you what happened. Let's go through it. So Lewis now is P2, and he then fell into a little bit of a stalemate for about 10 laps behind Max Verstappen. The gap was about 1.3 seconds, and Lewis, you could tell, was looking after the tyres, knowing he had a bit of a top speed advantage. He wasn't in DRS zone at any stage of this period, but he knew that he had that top speed advantage, so he could nurse the tyres a little in the middle of the lap. That was always going to be the critical thing, particularly on these medium tyres. And then it came down to the business of the undercut. It's not something, I have to confess here, I don't really understand the undercut, why the undercut sometimes is incredibly powerful and sometimes it's not. I think this is something that strategy engineers have come up with. It's well beyond my brain capacity. To me, it's all about, has the driver got grip? How well can he drive? If he is losing grip, can he do a better job than the other guy if he's losing grip? In other words, if the car's sliding around a little bit. Anyway, on this occasion, Lewis managed to stop. Mercedes brought Lewis in for his first set of hard tyres before Max Verstappen. And that, it appears now, caught Red Bull completely off guard, because they were under the impression or belief that the undercut was very powerful at Interlagos, and as a result, Lewis got even nearer. By the time they'd done both done their stops, Lewis is even nearer to Max. But part of that, and this is where I really don't get the undercut thing, for me, the most critical thing is how the two drivers perform relative to one another on cold tyres out of the pits when the tyres aren't fully up to temperature. And again, Lewis had the advantage, 29.8 to Max 30.4. Not a lot, but significant. If the gap's only been 1.5 seconds for the last 10 laps, there's Lewis Hamilton in one outlap, reducing it by half a second, 0.6 actually. So that's where, that to me was the significant thing. Then Max got on the radio to say, we must not be undercut again for the second stops coming up. So that was what was going on in Red Bull's mind, I guess, as they were approaching the second phase of this race. So another stalemate set in until lap 40, when Red Bull Honda brought Max in for his second set of hard times, determined on this occasion not to be undercut. I think we should just file that away now and come back to it in a few minutes. So Lewis then stayed out for another 3 laps, didn't really lose any time to Max in those 3 laps. And of course, when he came in, his tyres were 3 laps fresher, and that was going to be quite a significant advantage going into the back end of this race. So you've got to say at this point, really good move by Mercedes. They kind of called Red Bull's bluff. Having said that, Valtteri Bottas then got on the radio, and he was brought in just before Lewis to say, I think we just blew a sure 1-2 for the Mercedes team. We could have gone 1 stop, which, now I don't know whether he was actually told to say that or whether he actually believed that, because it's hard to understand how they could have gone 1 stop. But what we should do now is take that Red Bull undercut philosophy off the shelf and say, perhaps Red Bull were lured into making that second stop, and they didn't need to. Perhaps it was Red Bull that should have gone with a 1-stop strategy, and maybe that was the way they could have won this Brazilian Grand Prix. As it was, they were now left with a straight fight against Mercedes, obviously Max against Lewis and effectively Bottas against Sergio Pérez. But Pérez had got past when virtual safety car gave Bottas a bit of a lift in his second pit stop. So now it was a straight fight between these two, but the fuel loads were lighter and Lewis's tyres were 3 laps newer. Not a lot, but enough to make a difference in a car that was obviously going to be quite difficult on its tyres in the middle section of the Interlagos lap. But Lewis, with this top speed, about 7 kilometres an hour top speed advantage that he's had all weekend. And so it came down to this straight fight. It began with a skirmish at turn 4, with Lewis having caught Max in the DRS, doing a really good job. They go down to turn 4. He goes around the outside. Max is braking pretty late on the inside. On this occasion, the 2 early brakers are braking as late as one another. And Max, mid-corner, basically runs Lewis off the road, and Lewis moves to the outside. Again, lucky there is road runoff area to take there. And at that moment, I think a lot of people at Mercedes were thinking, Max is going to get done for this. We've seen this when Alex Albon was taken out on the outside by, I think it was Lewis in Austria a couple of years ago. This was exactly the same thing. They must have been slightly worried because Jonathan Wheatley, their sporting director, got immediately on the radio to Michael Massey saying, Michael, message from the Red Bull pit, let them race, let them race. And Michael Massey said, yeah, message received, message received. And then very shortly after, Ron Meadows, Jonathan Wheatley's counterpoint at Mercedes, got on the radio to say, so is anything going to happen? Is anything going to happen? And then shortly afterwards, the FIA declared that no action would be taken out of turn 4. I think many people breathed a sigh of relief there. I would go along with that, except for one thing. We've had too many incidents in the past now when somebody on the inside being passed on the outside has run wide, the guy on the outside has run out of road, and the guy on the inside is the one that's been penalised. And I've mentioned that a couple of times on these videos, that it's crazy to me that the stewards now think, or the FIA now think, that if you pass down the outside, it's a completely safe place to be. And if the guy on the inside runs you out, it's his fault and not yours. That is not the racing that I've known all my life. If you pass on the outside or attempt to pass on the outside, you're basically not going to do anything until the other guy turns in and you've got nowhere to go, and it's your fault and you're taking your own risk in your own hands. So I thought at that point that they would apply that because we've seen it in the past, but they didn't. And, that's good. But let's hope now, having got that remains the consistent policy for the next 100 years in Formula One, because there's nothing worse than having one set of rules at one race and another set of rules at another. So anyway, Max is now still in front of Lewis. Lewis is obviously very annoyed about this and starts to catch Max again. The question is, how's he going to do the pass? And they came down about 4 or 5 laps later. They came down into the dreaded turn 4 again, and Lewis is again right in the toe with the DRS. And Max does one of these big weave down the straight. And you thought again, we saw a bit of that going on at the British Grand Prix, and everybody kind of got away with it. But what is the actual situation with weaving? Are you allowed to do it or not? Anyway, a few laps later, Max got the black and white flag to warn him not to weave on the straight. To which Max's response was, perfect, say hi. I'm not quite sure what that meant. I think it was, well, it should have been, say hi because thank you very much. But it probably was, say hi, what a bunch of clowns, probably. But anyway, Lewis eventually did pull off the pass into the dreaded turn 4. And given the number of incidents he'd had there already with Max, it is amazing how clean the pass was in the end. He just got him and then bang, straight down into the apex and then pulled away at a second a lap. Pulled away at a second a lap because Max, in terms of, as they said afterwards, mitigating damage limitation for the championship, the difference between first and second is actually not very big these days. It's great from Lewis's point of view, obviously, to have won that Grand Prix. But from Max's point of view, P2 is a very strong championship result. So he was just going to then cruise to the finish, which is what he did. So that was the race. But I got to say, that was one of the best drives I've ever seen from any racing driver in any era in which I've been lucky enough to be watching Formula One. It was absolutely superb, considering from where Lewis was going, which was basically a 5-place grid penalty, plus then another back of the grid, 20. So it's 25 places in effect. Started from the back of the grid yesterday in the sprint race and then won the Grand Prix on Sunday. I don't know about you, but I actually found it very emotional when Lewis, on the slowdown lap, got hold of the Brazilian flag and took it back to the pits. That's a big thing for a British driver in a British-German team to do, and it says a lot, I think, about the fans in Brazil, because recently we've had quite a lot of whistling and catcalling for Lewis, and it's quite easy, I think, for a lot of people to get on the bandwagon and look at what Lewis is doing away from the track and make judgments about Lewis as a racing driver based on what you may or may not think about him outside the race car. It's a little bit the same with Nigel Mansell. I think a lot of people made their minds up about Nigel based on how he was out of the race car, not what he was doing in the race car. And I think it's the same with Lewis. I mean, to me, Lewis was just brilliant today. And, I've been going on about there are 3 drivers in terms of technique who are at the top of Formula One at the moment: Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc. But I think, I've got to revise a little bit here, because that drive by Lewis and his controlled aggression and his ability to be aggressive and make passes without in any way endangering what's going on around his car, front wing end plates, rear wing end plates, whatever it is, to get through even that first lap from the middle of the grid at Interlagos was incredible. And he was whipping up the fever with Valtteri Bottas as well. When they were behind the safety car early on, there was a bit of debris on the track following a shunt between Lance Stroll and Yuki Tsunoda, I think. And Lewis said, Valtteri, tell Valtteri to stay with me. We can get these guys today. You don't often hear things like that. I mean, it's the sort of thing you'd hear in other sports, but it's not, tell Valtteri to stay with me. We're going to do it. It was just great stuff. This was real motor racing. And I've run out of superlatives, really, because I think this was a day that we will remember for a long time. Certainly Lewis will remember for a long time. This is undoubtedly right up there with the greatest of his Grand Prix wins. And you, the viewer, I think, regardless of whether or not you think you're a Max Verstappen fan and therefore you don't like Lewis Hamilton, or whatever the polarization is at the moment, that race needs to be seen in its proper context, which is this racing driver who had these unbelievable penalties, passed all these cars to win the Brazilian Grand Prix. Let's just look at some of the other results. Valtteri Bottas, of course, started from the pole, and I said yesterday that it was kind of difficult being on the pole at Interlagos, because although you're on the clean side of the road, the inside is a great place to be in terms of the approach to turn 1. You've only got to make a mediocre start and you've basically got position. And that's what Max Verstappen did from P2. He finished second in the sprint race yesterday. That's what Max did from P2 in the Grand Prix today. Made a pretty good start. He's alongside Valtteri and basically just then took the line into turn 1 and pulled away. And as he came out of that corner, it was, yes, let's go. And I think at that moment, Max probably thought, job done, Grand Prix 1. It was a bit of a scrappy opening lap too for Valtteri, and the Ferraris were everywhere, and Charles Leclerc made the best of all that. Carlos Sainz ran wide, and all sorts of things going on. But in the middle of it all, Lewis Hamilton, as I say, amazingly good, staying out of trouble, but at the same time picking up positions already. So Valtteri then very quickly dropped back to P3 and then ceded his position to Lewis, as Lewis is just charging through the field in those first few laps. So from pole to, also ran podium finisher. It wasn't a great day for Valtteri Bottas, although from Mercedes' point of view, nice that he beat Sergio Pérez, of course. And Ferraris were 5th and 6th, pretty good result for them, all told. They were never going to beat Red Bull or Mercedes, but they got the best from the car, that can be said. And on this day, Charles Leclerc was back kind of where he belonged, ahead of Carlos Sainz. He got in front of Carlos on the first lap and stayed there thereafter. They ran a different strategy to everybody else. They ran mediums, a second set of mediums when they came in for their first stop. And that was quite a smart thing to do, just try something different, but it didn't really pay off. And of course, they had to go to the hards at the end. And I don't think it would have made any difference had they run that or the conventional strategy. And Pierre Gasly continued his strong weekend, best of the rest, ahead of the two Alpines, Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso, in that order. So yeah, what a Brazilian Grand Prix. The sad thing is, I think there's very little time for us to savour this race because we're in the middle of, would you believe, a triple header. And right now the teams, as I speak, are all packing up. It's dark in Interlagos, but the teams are packing up the forklift trucks. There are flashing lights, there are all the high-vis jackets as everybody's packing up the freight and trying to get out of Brazil as soon as possible because next weekend racing for the first time in Qatar. So as I say, not a lot of time to savour everything that happened today, but we had the two championship contenders one-on-one ahead of the rest of the field, lots going on between them. On this occasion, they actually both finished the race. They didn't actually damage one another's cars. And on this occasion, Max Verstappen was the sort of Niki Lauda of the Brazilian Grand Prix. He fought hard, and then when he knew he'd lost his position, he just settled for second place. And Lewis Hamilton, from P25, in effect, Lewis Hamilton from P25 won the Brazilian Grand Prix.